Another major focus for young people, and it's a new area within the climate movement, is eco-anxiety, eco-grief, this overwhelming anxiety related to the realities of the climate crisis and environmental degradation in our communities. It is a growing field within the climate space, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that young people are really facing climate anxiety. This is quite literally our future.
Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In this episode, I'll be in conversation with Tori Goebel, National Organizer and Spokesperson for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. YECA works to mobilize youth to act against climate change, to advocate for creation care, and to promote the hope among young people that a better climate future is possible. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Well, welcome, Tori. It's so great to have you on the Earth Keepers podcast.
Welcome. It is so lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Perhaps you could start us off by telling us about Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, about what you do and who your organization serves in particular.
YECA exists to equip, educate, and mobilize young Christians to love God and love our neighbors through bold, wholehearted, and faithful climate action in our churches and communities in order to create a more equitable, just, and loving world. And so our audience, our typical definition of young is 18 to 30. We have had folks who are engaged and awesome in high school as well. More and more, we're seeing that definition of young is getting younger and younger, which is really exciting. And if you're listening and you're over 30, by no means, we are not saying you are old.
Good thing. Well, I'm curious, how did your story come to intersect with the story of YECA?
So I really became aware of the reality of the climate crisis in undergrad. It was not until college that I really began to learn about the ways that climate and the environment were intersecting with my faith and to really explore those realities of climate change. I went to Gordon College, a small Christian school here in Massachusetts, and I was in a required science class, and one of the modules was on energy and the environment. And that's where we really began to learn how things like climate change was already impacting communities all around the world and here in the United States. We looked at an indigenous community that was facing displacement due to things like land erosion and food insecurity. It really broke my heart, and I also became confused. I was confused why Christians weren't taking this issue seriously, at least in my experience. I grew up going to a church that was really focused on things like missions and caring for our neighbors, loving the poor, but those conversations never extended to the realities of climate change and environmental problems. But through this course, I began to see how my faith, my values really have a lot to say about this issue and really compel me to act. So then I went on kind of unsure how my studies of communications, this newfound awareness, and my faith could really fit together. There was no one in my life at that time to help connect those pieces, to connect that puzzle for me. And so I went on, I worked for a small nonprofit outside of Washington, D.C., focused on career and technical education. At that time, I also became more and more aware of local environmental problems, things like the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and I felt a calling, a nudging in my spirit to engage with this work. And so I did some part-time volunteering, but more and more really wanted some full-time work in this space and really was thinking about ways that I could use my communications experience and degree in this field. And that's when an old professor of mine posted the job with YECA and our parent organization, the Evangelical Environmental Network, as Director of Communications. And all at once, there was that intersection between faith, the environment, and my passion for communications. And it just, a total God moment. It felt like I had found a space where there were people who were helping young people in particular draw those connections in ways that I didn't have, and were really empowering people to take action on climate through the lens of their faith. And so that was over 6 years ago now. That's kind of how my story came to intersect with EN and YECA.
I appreciate your authenticity there. I'm sure there are lots of younger folks, especially who are listening to the podcast, who maybe have the same questions. How do they take their skills, their interests, their passions, and actually make a difference in the world? So appreciate your story. I'm sure it's encouraging for them. So one question I'm sure a lot of people have from the get-go is about the name of your organization, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. In the broader culture conversation, parts of the church, as we know, have gained a reputation for not supporting the care of the earth, and some even seem to oppose it. So the question that many of our listeners will have is this: how is it that evangelicals are for climate action?
This is a great question. I'm excited to dive in with this. As evangelical climate scientist Dr. Catherine Hayhoe says, everyone already has everything they need to care about climate. I think this is particularly true for evangelicals. Climate and the environment connect to every facet of our lives, and it is intimately connected to our calling as followers of Christ to love God and love our neighbors. I think we can love God by caring for what God cares for, including creation and our neighbors. And I don't think we can fully love our neighbors while ignoring things like climate change and pollution. That's why our motto as an organization is an expression and extension of the greatest commandment: love God, love your neighbor, act on climate. The Bible shouts God's care and concern for creation, and for far too long, evangelicals in the United States have ignored that. Genesis 2:15 tells us that we are to serve and protect the garden. Psalm 19 tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of God's hands. Romans 1:20 says that for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. And this is just a sampling of all that Scripture has to say about the created world. I think climate action and creation care connect to many of the things that evangelicals typically care about. For example, evangelicals are known for their concern for the sanctity of life. I think this ought to be extended to a person's entire life, which has to include caring for things like air and water quality, public health, and safe and resilient communities. For example, right now we are advocating for strong protections under the mercury and air toxic standard. Mercury is a highly dangerous neurotoxin that impacts everyone, but is especially dangerous for people living near power plants. In particular, pregnant women and their unborn children and young children are at extreme risk from mercury pollution, and it causes all sorts of health problems in multiple systems in our body, including the neurological system. I don't think anyone can be truly, authentically pro-life while ignoring opportunities to strengthen safeguards for things like mats that are really designed to protect and save the lives of pregnant women and their babies. So for me, the question is not how evangelicals are for climate action, but how are they not?
But given all the support that you showed us that's evident in Scripture, I'm wondering, how did so much of the church get it wrong in terms of our relationship to creation? Because those Scriptures don't really characterize the way that much of the church looks at creation and considers itself as part of creation.
Absolutely. And I think the evangelical church's inaction on this issue has really hurt our witness and credibility. Young people are frustrated that their places of worship have failed to take this seriously, and people outside of the Christian faith have expressed to me confusion about why Christians don't seem to be caring for God's creation. It looks like, and it often is, hypocrisy. So this should be an issue where Christians are really leading, but instead it often seems like many are dragging their feet. So how did it all go wrong? The Pew Research Center recently released a report exploring the views of religious Americans on climate and the environment. They found that for Americans who are skeptical or deny the reality of climate change, these motivations have less to do with faith and science and are really rooted in partisan identity, especially for older evangelicals in particular. So I think a lot of folks have really married their faith to their politics and have confused or even chosen party lines over what Scripture is telling us. At the same time, there have been intentional misinformation campaigns designed to sow distrust of the science and to create fear of environmental safeguards and climate solutions. That's why it's so important to not only combat misinformation, but to empower the people who are ready and able to reach these communities. And while this is grim, young people give me hope. Their study found a generational divide in views that exist regardless of political party. In short, young people of all political backgrounds want to take action on climate change. And this has been my experience time and again. Young people are really eager and ready to act on this and are not as skeptical as their older evangelical counterparts.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to know more about your motivations. Why is it important for you to be one who advocates for creation? And maybe if you would, describe for us your relationship to nature and perhaps even some of the early influences that shaped that relationship.
Simply put, for me, I'm doing this because I'm a follower of Christ who is trying to live out my faith here and now. And I truly don't believe I can do that fully without caring for God's creation and my neighbors who are suffering from the impacts of climate and other environmental concerns and all sorts of health problems caused by things like poor air and poor water quality, for example. For me, when it comes to nature, I often feel closest to God when I'm outside, exploring, and enjoying nature. I find it to be a place of refreshment and renewal. If people are passionate about sharing God's love with others, I think that can and should include ensuring that others can experience God's majesty in the natural environment and continue to benefit from our interconnectedness with the natural world. Exploring nature, particularly national parks and public lands, was a significant part of my upbringing, and it really instilled a love of nature within me. From a young age, my parents made sure I was outside, everywhere from Grand Canyon in Arizona to local parks. One place in particular that has been significant to my family for multiple generations is the White Mountain region in northern New Hampshire. I grew up exploring waterfalls, hiking trails, and rocky rivers in that area, as did my mom and her mom before her. We still strive to go there at least once a year, and it is places like this that remind me that God's entire creation is good and worthy of protection so that future generations can have the same experience for years and years and continue to feel God out in the natural world.
Well, in terms of your work with evangelicals, you probably, I'm guessing, experience both resistance to your message, but also enthusiasm on the part of some people, as you pointed out. I'm curious, does the work of YECA strive to engage both sides, both responses? And if so, how do the strategies differ in terms of reaching those people?
Well, Yale tells us with their program on climate change communication that there's actually 6 Americas when it comes to climate change. It's not necessarily a binary of on board and against climate change, but rather people do exist on this spectrum. And in terms of our own experience, I would say we are actually met with enthusiasm and interest as a primary response, especially working with younger Christians. There may be resistance with social media trolls and people in the comments, but in person and at events, I do find that it is all interest or curiosity. More than dismissal, folks are often just intrigued because they haven't heard this message in church or in their communities and they want to know more. Our messaging strategy is always rooted in scripture and mostly remains the same. We always try to lead with the Bible and with stories. We seek to build on existing and shared values and identities. And we work to empower trusted messengers who are already a part of the community that they want to reach. I find this to be both authentic and effective at reaching hearts and minds. And when people ask me for advice on how to reach people who may be unsure or uninformed about climate, I tell them that the first step is to actually listen. Listen to the values and concerns being shared. Like I mentioned, climate change touches every part of our lives, including issues that people might find to be more pressing or concerning than climate change. Of course, folks are worried about the rising cost of living, food security, having family-sustaining jobs, the health of their children. But the reality is that climate change is connected with these concerns. It isn't separate. Transitioning to a healthy, clean energy economy is directly related to the cost of living and job security. Reducing pollution is directly tied to the health of our communities. Climate change connects to all of our very real concerns, things like racial justice and mental health, access to healthy food and water. If we take the time to listen to these concerns of the people we want to reach, we will be able to have meaningful conversations that connect their concerns to climate and the environment in ways they may not have heard before. And I often tell people, for folks who are dismissive, that last category on Yale's 6 Americas, it's a small percentage. It's like 6 or 9% of people are completely dismissive, deny that climate change is happening, and don't want to talk about it. And that's really not that many people, and we don't need them to take meaningful action on climate change. And so it's okay to protect your mental and spiritual well-being and to not engage with the haters and the trolls online or in your own life, because caring for yourself and caring for those around you is far more important than engaging with those debates with people who are more likely than not going to see the light because they don't want to.
You had referenced Catherine Hayhoe earlier, and much of what you're saying now reminds me of her advice to us, especially in terms of listening being the starting point for a conversation with people whose views differ from ours. And also that idea that we can always find points of connection, points of common interest as a beginning of conversation, rather than starting with the sort of intractable differences. So I appreciate that. I note that obviously you focus on young people, and one reason I was really keen to have you on the Earth Keepers podcast has to do with the fact that a theme that we're focusing on this year is the response of millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha to the present and future realities of climate crisis. So in your work, what are some of the most difficult struggles among the young folks when it comes to climate change?
One of them is something we already touched on: older evangelicals who may be indifferent or even care, but just find other issues more pressing for one reason or another. So really working to engage with those older folks in our life who might not fully understand our work or our calling quite yet. And related to that is having access and authority in church spaces. It's no secret that young people are leaving the church, and I find this isn't necessarily out of loss of faith or hatred, but rather frustration at the very real hypocrisy of not caring about climate change and other pressing issues of justice in our time. And so churches are really eager to have young people in the pews. That's where the conversation ends. Young people aren't always given the same access and authority to speak into the life of the church. That can be due to some hidden ageism. It can be related to things like singleness. So many church spaces don't view single Christians as full members of the church. And so it's really important that church understand the importance of young people and also invest in inviting them into the leadership of the church and being able to speak on things like the importance of creation care. There's also a tendency, and I think this extends beyond faith spaces, of this mindset with older folks who say the children are doing great things, young people are leading the way on climate, we're going to leave it up to them, this is their future and they're leading. And I really love the support and the empowerment from older folks, but we need everyone in this fight. And while young people may be the leaders tomorrow, like leaders in Congress, there are older folks who are the leaders of today, and that's really when the action needs to happen. And so we do need older folks not just supporting us and encouraging us, but rather joining the fight with us, making meaningful changes in their churches, their businesses, in Congress. We can't just listen and support the young people. We need everyone of all generations to advocate alongside us for a more just future. And another major focus for young people, and it's a new area within the climate movement, is eco-anxiety, eco-grief. This overwhelming anxiety related to the realities of the climate crisis and environmental degradation in our communities. It is a growing field within the climate space, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that young people are really facing climate anxiety. This is quite literally our future. It is our ability to have well-paying, family-sustaining jobs in the future. Things like the mercury pollution impacts decisions to have children, because if there's dangerous toxins in the air, what are responsible choices? There's so much anxiety tied to these choices and decisions that are in other people's hands that it can lead to some extreme anxiety and also eco-grief at the climate impacts we're already seeing.
Friends, as you may know, a main focus of Season 4 of the Earth Keepers podcast is listening to the voices of the young when it comes to Earth care. For that reason, we foreground the perspectives of young activists and leaders like Tori Goebel of YECA. Our next episode will feature a familiar voice from the millennial generation. While I am in Ireland interviewing people for future episodes of the podcast, Wes Willison will step in for me to host a very different sort of episode. Wes will be walking listeners through something called the Onion Session, drawn from the book called The Supper of the Lamb by Robert Farrar Capon. This is a guided meditation that is meant to focus our attention on one small and humble object. This soul-opening exercise helps us to perceive the wonder contained in an onion and to appreciate it as one part of creation loved by God. So this is a heads up. When you listen to the next episode of Earth Keepers, guest hosted by Wes Willison, be advised that you'll need an onion, a small knife, a cutting board, and about an hour of uninterrupted time in a quiet space. And for those who feel a little skepticism about such a strange-sounding thing as meditating on an onion, trust me, it will calm your soul and give you a new perspective on food, creation, and the world of things around you. For now, let's get back to our conversation with Tori Goebel. I really concur when you talk about young people not feeling support where they might expect support, especially from the churches they belong to or grew up in even. I'm assuming that YECA in some ways exists to support those folks in ways that they aren't supported elsewhere. And it makes me curious about what are some of the things that the organization actually does to help young people feel some hope, feel some empowerment, some agency in terms of advocating for the planet.
Yeah, it's so important. So to accomplish our mission, there are three main pillars of our work. The first is mobilizing our generation. The main way we do that is through our leadership development programs. We have our Climate Leadership Fellows program that started off as a program for undergraduate students in college to identify needs in their community and then craft plans to address them over the course of the academic year. And so fellows have done incredible things like start clubs on campus, start recycling and composting programs, get solar panels on campus, create art and content, magazines, podcasts, as well as do things like organize speaker series in chapel or their classes. And then in 2021, we started a community fellowship building off the success of the college program, but really designed to support the work and leadership of young Christians in frontline communities who are working with their churches and just their communities around climate justice issues. We also have other casual leadership development programs like our Climate Advocates, which provides monthly calls, and we have access to online training modules that are provided on demand. Whereas for our fellowship programs, we do a week-long live training that has been online the past few years, and that covers everything from theology and science to project planning and community organizing. We also provide other action opportunities for folks to reach out to their members of Congress. Right now, a lot of our work is on the regulatory side. Right now on our website, for example, folks can go to the Take Action section and find an easy form. It just launched this week to submit a public comment to the Environmental Protection Agency about the importance of strengthening MATS, the mercury neurotoxic standard. And so that is really easy because there's background information if you want to learn more. And there's a pre-crafted comment that you're free to edit, but all you have to do is just put in your information and that will send it right off to the EPA in time for their open comment period. And so those are some ways that we work to mobilize our generation. The second part of our work is engaging with our churches. Like we talked about, so many young people at YECA, including myself, didn't hear about climate change and the environment growing up in church, but we really want to change that legacy of inaction and help our churches to live more fully into our faith by acting on climate. And so within our leadership development programs, we talk about engaging churches and building strategies for that. And we also provide different resources to help people engage with this through the lens of their faith. At the same time, we also want to hold church leaders accountable. In 2020, we wrote an open letter to the attendees of the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C., calling on them to take climate change seriously in their churches and to go home from the prayer breakfast, not only having prayed about climate, but by talking about climate change, starting ministries, and preaching sermons on creation care. That open letter was published in the Religion News Service, and then we went to the National Prayer Breakfast to hand out the letter to folks as they walked inside. The third part of our work is holding our political leaders accountable. Climate change is a widespread, system-wide issue that's going to require bold, transformative responses from all levels, including the government. And so we want to hold our leaders accountable for bold and just climate solutions. Right now, I had mentioned our advocacy opportunities. That's what's really happening on that front. In the fall, we ran a robust voter engagement campaign, really helping folks have the tools to get out and vote with climate in mind. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We don't endorse candidates, but we did want to provide resources for folks to learn what was on their ballot, where to even cast their ballot, and how to figure out how different candidates or even ballot measures stood when it came to the environment. And so we reached almost 200,000 young people across the country with text messages, letters. We did some peer-to-peer outreach, and we also equipped folks to reach out to their own communities on voter engagement issues and get out the vote, as well as helping folks do things like check their voter registration and get registered to vote if they weren't.
I'm intrigued in your answers, how often you use the word leader and leadership. And it makes me wonder why the focus on leadership for YECA? And maybe even what kind of leaders are you trying to raise up?
We believe that young people are the best messengers for their own communities and congregations. And we know that young people are ready and eager to act on climate. In fact, young people are already leading and taking initiative. You can see this through things like School Strike for Climate and other youth-led climate movements focused on building a better, safer world. Over the years, YECA has developed comprehensive training programs that cover so many topics, and we were especially delighted to have our fellowship program recognized by the American Climate Leadership Award. We do all this to provide skills and resources needed to take serious climate action, and also to further equip the young people already doing things in their own communities. Our theory of change for our fellowship really revolves around the fact that these young people know their communities well and are the best people to identify needs and create a plan to address them. And so we want to come alongside the work in any way that is meaningful. For us, we want to raise leaders that are empowered and equipped to take action through the lens of their faith, and we think we do that well. The young leaders at YECA are incredibly humble, passionate, faithful, and eager. And we just try to provide avenues to deepen that and help them enact that change they want to see.
Could you give us a story or two about some of the leaders who maybe are doing inspiring things in terms of advocating for the earth or working against climate despair? Help us to understand what young people are doing that we might take inspiration from.
There are so many stories. I could go on all day with incredible tales from the young people doing the work on the ground. Perhaps I'll start with part of a quote from a fellow at Pepperdine University in California, just wrapping up that college fellowship right now as the school year ends. She says, "With every project that I complete, I feel like I'm directly impacting my university and inspiring others to care about sustainability. The feedback I've received about my project from friends, professors, and other fellows has been so uplifting. I'm so proud to be a fellow and represent Christians who care about the planet." This fellow did some really incredible things on her campus around composting and food education. In the fall semester, she crafted a proposal for housing services to fund and install 200 composting bins in academic and residential buildings. And this program was approved by the administration and has since gone into effect. And for anyone who works with educational institutions, you know it's a lot to ask for money and work and time around something they weren't already planning on doing. And I think that's just a testament to the incredible work that our fellows do and the ways that they really seek to build connections and relationships with school decision makers. Another example, last year, a community fellow in North Carolina set out to build connections between churches, the community members, and local organizations working on food security in particular. Through her work, she was able to raise awareness about food services in the community, and she secured a sub-grant to fund a community fridge for a local organization. And it's estimated that 100,000 additional families will be served through the efforts of this project. Like I said, I could truly go on all day about the growth and exciting development in communities and campuses around the country. And I find so much hope in the work and the leadership of these young people.
Yeah, I think those are really encouraging stories. I wonder, do you guys have a way that you publish those stories so that if people wanted to hear more, they could actually go and find out what those folks are doing?
That's a great question. And we should do more on amplifying these stories because they are important. We are a small shop here, but I'm really glad that we have the chance to share stories on platforms like this podcast. If folks are curious, do find us on social media. Oftentimes we'll share quotes and highlights of work that our fellows are doing to try to amplify those experiences. And there's also some reflections posted on our blog from other young people. One is from November. A climate advocate went to COP27 in Egypt and was able to share her reflection on attending as an official UN climate observer. And so our blog is also a place to find some uplifting and exciting stories about the work YECA people are doing.
And they can find access to all those things on your website.
Yes, at yecaction.org.
Got it. And we'll put that website in the show notes as well. Well, this podcast has listeners from 97 countries today. And of course, most of them come from very diverse age groups and cultures. But most everyone wants to know what they can actually do to become better Earth keepers. So what are some practical takeaways that you hope they might glean from our conversation today?
I hope that everyone listening is able to find meaningful practices that both care for creation, but also serve as faithful acts of discipleship that can help sustain you for this work. If things like gardening and working with soil are nurturing for you, how might that connect to things like where your food comes from and eating food locally, even in your own backyard? If walking around and exploring your neighborhood is enjoyable, how might you drive less or utilize public transit to get around? If your church community brings you joy, how might you deepen their engagement with creation? I also think it's important to find a community of folks who are like you and who are taking climate action. If that's YECA, great. If not, I encourage you to find like-minded folks and organizations taking action and engaging on things you care about. If you're an older evangelical in the US, the Evangelical Environmental Network is doing some great things and has a variety of programs and opportunities for you. If you're listening to this podcast, you may already be involved with Circlewood, but perhaps there are ways you can expand your engagement there. If you're global, check out groups like ORASHA. There are so many great organizations where you can be a part of them and really build on that individual action in order to strengthen that important collective engagement.
Now, people can access the material and resources on your site without being a certain age, I'm gathering. There's no age filter?
Absolutely. Our programs are limited to our traditional age audience. However, everything on our website is open to folks. Even things like submitting a comment to the EPA about the mercury or toxic standard. It has language of being a young Christian, but that form is editable for a reason. And so you can go there and still submit a comment, access those resources. And we have folks of all ages and backgrounds who receive our newsletter, share our stuff on social media. And so we are so grateful for the intergenerational support we receive. And we hope that there are some nuggets and some things for you to enjoy on our website and social media platforms.
Now, speaking of intergenerational support, if folks who are older than millennials have young folks in their lives, how might you recommend that they support the young people in terms of helping them to work against climate despair or helping them to have vision for their place in making the world a better place in the future?
I think creating space for these young people to take action, to speak into what's happening, if that's a church, take the time to listen. Take a young person out to coffee and listen to the issues that they care about and ideas they might have for the church community. If you are a business and there are some young people on your staff, do the same thing. Take time to just listen to the young people, to just stop and hear the concerns that they have and ideas they might have for creating change. I think that's really important. Also, just offering support and solidarity, letting them not only share what they care about, but hopefully you feel the same and you are passionate about the same things. So just letting them know that you too care about what they care about and really want to empower them to take action in that way. If you are in a place to do so, you can support the organizations they support financially, through prayer, joining newsletters, amplifying their messages on social media. It sounds like a small thing, but even just sharing a post from a person or an organization really boosts the reach of that. It helps the organization, the person reach more people, and it helps the algorithm on social media. Things like that are really important and are sometimes underutilized.
So I'm imagining that people look to you for answers a lot of the time, expect you to help them to have hope. I am curious, how do you balance having a realistic perspective on the one hand about where the planet is heading with having hope enough to work for a better future?
This is such an important question, and it's a question I think folks might have to come back and ask themselves over and over. And this is where the faith community can really offer a much needed dose of hope and optimism. Staying rooted in my faith is essential not only for self-care, but maintaining perspective and staying grounded. While my faith is a source of hope, I also believe we're called to some prophetic truth-telling, including about the severity and the urgency of the climate crisis. We have to listen to science and act at the speed and scale required, and that can feel scary. Every IPCC report highlights the urgency of the climate crisis and calls us to act and act now because that window to avoid the very worst impacts is closing. But it is not closed. If we're going to listen to the scientists about the scary reality of the climate crisis, we cannot fall into a hopeless pit of doom by failing to listen to the other part of that message, that there is still time to act. In fact, I just went to the IPCC website and it says, latest, urgent climate action can secure a livable future for all. There is so much work to be done, and we cannot afford to stop working for a better future. I can totally understand the tendency to give in to the doom and gloom, and I myself have days of overwhelming climate anxiety. Our leaders are not acting fast enough, and still followers of Christ are denying what creation is telling us. But we cannot let that define our calling and will to act. So I think we have to create space for both emotions, hope and fear, while at the same time finding our hope in Christ and staying connected to community. I think this tension and balance is a part of living in the now but not yet kingdom of God and joining in the reconciling work of Christ. Time and again, we have to come back to the calling to love God and love our neighbors.
We've been in conversation with Tori Goebel, National Organizer and Spokesperson for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. To learn more about the organization and to discover resources for climate action, go to the show notes for this episode. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music, and Timothy Connor is our podcast editor. Our research assistant is Alex Megerly, and Jessalyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.